thanks everyone for being here. We're really honored that you chose to join our workshop. Beth is the co-author of this presentation and the book that we're presenting on. And she had a situation with her family and she's unable to join. And I was laughing that this is actually the most natural way for Beth and I to collaborate, because we wrote this entire book on Zoom. So we probably wouldn't even know how to be in the same room together. So this is really comfortable for us. Yes. And I wanted to just mention too, we got the idea for this book. Am I okay? You're fine. Okay, great. We got the idea for this book in Texas CBE 2019. We shared a room together. We collaborators over many years, and we were both in a kind of a finicky job situation at the time with a lot of frustrations, and we got to do something about it. And we decided to write this book, and then, the world went into lockdown, and we wrote this book over COVID. And it took a lot of delays not because it's going to be the greatest masterpiece you'll ever read, but just because our brains were exploding like most of yours probably. I also want to address the other kind of elephant in the room, which is something that we heard from Michelle Sanchez yesterday, which is, white women's feminism. You can't see Beth on the screen, but she's white. I'm white. I'm an immigrant, but I'm still a white woman. And I think what we address really in the first pages of the book is, this is a conversation that is we're hearing from many, many leaders in this space currently. We're hearing on diversity, we're hearing on belonging, and we cannot have this conversation led by white women. Beth and I wanted to contribute to this conversation because of our 30 years of collective experience in the faith-based sector. We did not want to miss out on contributing our real-life experiences working in some of the highest leadership in nonprofit spaces. But we also want to make sure that it's clear to the reader and to our audience members that we are working with collaboration and hearing from women of color in this space, and they are the ones who should be leading all of us in this space. So we're very humbled to collaborate. You'll read, if you get the book, you'll read a lot of inputs from women of color, and also, if at the end of the day we get diversity in our organizations, we're actually fine. Okay. Yeah, thank you. And it's 50% white men and 50% white women will have failed. So the goal of belonging is a diverse rainbow of people leading our organizations. So we just wanted to start with saying that we are aware of that, and we have considered it as we've done our research. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beth.
Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there. CBE is one of my favorite places because the energy that we get, and just to be with colleagues who are working on the same issues, and it feels like a place of family. So, Eeva, how are we doing with sound? Am I projecting well enough?
Yep. Back row says thumbs up.
Okay, very good. So my name is Beth Birmingham. I have 25 years in Christian higher education, but working specifically with Christian NGOs on leadership and organizational culture issues. So my PhD is in leadership. And my very first experiences in faith-based ministry were spaces where I didn't know gender issues were even a problem. So if you know Eastern University, you know it's the first university, Protestant university in the country to have a female president. Dr. Roberta Hestenes was president of Eastern University when I joined in 1995. 7 out of the 11 vice presidents of Eastern at the time were women. The theologians that teach at Eastern University and then Eastern Seminary, now Palmer Seminary, people like Ron Sider, people like Samuel Escobar, they teach from a gender egalitarian theology. And I studied also at Eastern, and so I didn't know we had a problem. I do recall Roberta getting leveled with a critique by some of our male faculty that she was very masculine in her leadership style. And the phrase around some of the, hallways where she can be real hell on heels. And I remember being, this young 20-something, just so admiring the fact that she was the first and thinking, I can see the flecks of glass in her hair from the ceilings that she has broken through to help pave the way for the rest of us. So you can see, even back then, we're still dealing with these same issues of female-style leadership, male-style leadership, feminine-style leadership, masculine-style leadership, and how it's appropriate for some and not appropriate for others. And so hopefully someday in our lifetime we will get beyond that. But then that little group on the left was my work team. And here was two theologian leadership experts, guys, who again, they just created a sense of belonging. I didn't know there was an issue. And so it wasn't until we started engaging more and more with faith-based NGOs around the world for leadership development purposes that I started noticing fewer and fewer women in the room, and started hearing from my female students from all around the globe of how they were treated in their organizations, in their cultures that didn't want them to be getting further studies. And so my interest in this was purely academic, purely empathy, until maybe about 5-6 years ago, I left Christian higher ed to join the NGO world and started to realize, wow, there is something to this. These spaces are not welcoming spaces for voices of color, which is quite a stunner when you think about it, because the global NGO world serves 80, 90, 100 countries of the world. And yet when you look at their executive teams here in the U.S. Agencies, there's no representation, unless it's the Africa vice president happens to be an African, or the Asian vice president happens to be an Asian. But for the most part, the strategic decisions about what happens in 80 to 100 countries of the world are being made by white American men. And I tend to not be one to keep quiet when I notice there's a problem. And so started speaking up on this and started to help the organization I was with strategize to make a difference. So that really was what birthed this. Some research that I started doing 5-6 years ago, intentional research, surveys, focus groups, lived experience stories. And Eeva and I had been working together in another organization, having a very different, wonderful experience together, but really recognized that this is something that we want to speak on. We've got experience, we want to speak on it. So we both came to CBE, did presentations in 2019, and InterVarsity was in the audience, and they said, we don't have enough women speaking about leadership stuff. I think you need to turn these talks into a book. And so that's where we joined together to do that. So here we are today. Next slide. Thanks. So you have all read the McKinsey research. You'll be interested to know in the global development space, much of the executive decision-making is really influenced by secular literature. So Harvard Business Review, Harvard Business Publications, McKinsey research, they're not living and making their strategic decisions by what's being published in Mutuality. They're not making their strategic leadership decisions by what's being published in Christianity Today or theological journals. So if you want to get the attention of the executive teams across the global development sector, you need to be pulling in the business research. And so I tend to use this stuff in my teaching, and I track McKinsey. You and I both know that McKinsey's done a brilliant job in the corporate world for the last 15 years of tracking gender diversity and racial diversity movement. And they have an 1,100 organizations that they study. And we were starting to see really positive, movement. Slow, but at least the numbers were heading in the right trajectory. And then, boom, 2020 hits, and as you know, COVID has sent a lot of things backward. So here's a look at 2021 research realities today. You can see how terribly lagging we still are on gender leadership, women of color, horrible, horrible realities, and men of color are still not making inroads to the magical 35-40% number, which is the number that when we have that kind of diversity, when we have 40% diversity, 50% diversity, we actually start to see the better business outcomes for our organizations. So look how woefully behind we are when it comes to those numbers. And what do we get for it? What is the business case? Past McKinsey research has shown companies that have at least 35% diversity around their leadership tables have 25 to 32% greater return on investment, return on equity. They have greater innovation. They have greater employee engagement. Now, when you put that on the nonprofit sector, when you put that on the global NGO sector, it's hard for people to translate what that could mean because we don't measure our success by return on investment and return on equity. But just think about it in the conceptual framework. If your Living Water International organization is able to perform 30% better in the coming year because you have gotten this right, that is 30% more communities around the world that are going to have clean water, better housing, less child trafficking, more child development. Name any one of your favorite sectors and focuses of global development. We're going to see improvement in those outcomes if we can push the needle and start getting greater diversity around the table. Next slide. So those, the reality that we are finding, and again, you well know, McKinsey did track one interesting thing that was a sad reality for many women coming out of COVID, and it's the level of burnout we're seeing. And so just look at those numbers, the percentages of people that are burned out in their workplaces. And again, this is the corporate world. I would suspect we would see much higher rates of employee burnout in the nonprofit and ministry world because we have that mindset that ministry is never done. There's no such thing as a 9-to-5 day in Christian ministry. So, and from what we have seen in the Great Resignation across the development sector, and just in conversations with our sisters around the world, they're exhausted. They're burned out. They're trying to juggle homeschooling their kids, extra care at home, taking care of their elderly parents, and still managing to live and work on a Zoom environment for 12, 14 hours a day. So what we have found, though, is that managers who've been intentional about supporting employee well-being and prioritizing diversity, their employees are rating themselves as much happier, experiencing less burnout, and they're less likely to consider leaving their job. And so again, all that's fairly intuitive, and you're thinking, well, get to the meat. You know, how do we actually move the needle? And we are going to go there. But just to give you a glimpse, the last McKinsey stat, we had the diversity numbers were up around 20, 21, 22% in the corporate world. Let me show you what the faith-based development sector looks like. Now, these are organizations like World Vision International, Compassion International, Food for the Hungry, World Relief, Habitat for Humanity, okay? So you've got the mindset of who we're talking about here. Here's what we know. 70% of the people that these organizations serve are women. 60 to 70% of the ones doing the work are women. That's a global UN stat. The majority of the workforce in global development work are women. 70% of those writing the checks or scanning their credit card every month to give to that NGO are women, even if their name is not on the checkbook. And yet, less than 15% of the leaders around the leadership tables of these organizations are women. So you have the majority of the work, the majority of the giving, the majority of the ones we're focused on being women, and this tiny little portion of women having a voice and influence in the strategic choices and decision-making of these agencies. It just seems so crazy to me, being a very logical person, that here we are in 2022, and these are still the realities.
Great. So, who was in the room when these organizations were designed? And we're speaking really of we know that a lot of the community development, up and coming smaller NGOs are women-led and they're women of color-led. We know that. But these main sector organizations that really drive the income, drive the grant revenue into the sector, who was in the room when these organizations were pulled together? A quick look at the history of our sector, of what we call the missional nonprofit sector. We call missional organizations that are Christian faith driven, whether they're currently professing as Christian, they have a history of Christian origins, and you'd be surprised at how many of them there are. They are mostly missionary movement and military movement birthed. So in the 1800s, there was a significant representation of women in the missionary sector. There were a lot of women going out, either as single women missionaries, as wives, as young women taking care of missionary families. There was a huge representation, and many of you have read that history. But as soon as these movements get formalized or kind of folded into a denomination or start to develop these kind of development arms, the men are the ones who have taken up leadership. So it's been this dichotomy of women doing the work of volunteerism and care, and then men stepping, when it's the time to do the real work of leadership, it's been men who have stepped into those roles. This military element is also extremely interesting. Post World War I and II, especially post World War II, there were a lot of military presence still in Europe, and that's really also where my organization, World Relief, got started in 1944, where they wanted to kind of the military wanted to build a better PR and a brand, and they took on some of this volunteerism work through missionary collaborations with missionaries, but it's still based on male exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, and even Christian faith exceptionalism. And all of those kind of sound more like colonialism than the kind of collaborative partnership we're looking to have in these communities. So there's a lot of pain points there, and not the least the fact that women, therefore, have not been considered when a lot of the structures and the policies and the practices and way these organizations are run were put in place. So that's a big concern. And then overriding with that is the theological aspect, which we'll dig into a bit more. So I wanted to just read this quick quote for you all because, let me see if I can find it here. Technologies, again. This is from the secular sector.
Want me to read it?
No, I had sent it to myself and now I can't find it. But so, okay, I have to paraphrase it because I'm having... Here it is. Look at me. Okay, so this is a secular researcher, Michelle P. King, who's researched a lot of organizations. But this is really like pointing to why so many women feel unwelcomed and uncomfortable in the sector. Workplaces don't work for everybody the same way because they were never designed for difference. They were designed to support an ideal type of a worker to succeed, and this tends to be a white, middle-class, heterosexual, able-bodied male who most importantly is willing to make work their number one priority and engage in dominant, aggressive, assertive, competitive, and even exclusionary behaviors to get there. And Beth and I maintain we are not in the business of bashing white, middle-aged, able-bodied men. My husband's a white, able-bodied man, and I think he's quite great. I think the goal here is the missing element of collaboration and shared leadership. And that if we're centering just one type of a person, it gets us in real trouble as organization. So this exists today. This is a quote from our book, and it's an actual quote from a lady working in one of these organizations. During my tenure with the organization, I've seen women enter and exit our executive team. They'll come and make progress for 6 to 18 months, and suddenly something happens and they are out. Maybe it's that they can't do the job, sure, but the men don't have the same track record. Men serving these roles for a decade at a time. Why is it that women are so unsuitable for these roles? What is holding women back? It's almost like some invisible qualifier cuts women out before they even get started. So we went to research a bit. What are some of those reasons that are cutting women out, really even before they can catch their stride? There is a preference for male leadership, and this is really prevalent in the Christian world, where it's in our DNA. We're literally socialized to prefer male leadership. It's in our churches, it's in our homes, it's in our schooling, it's everywhere. And by the age we're 7, our concepts about what a role of a woman and what a role of a man has been established in our head. And that's a really hard thing to break later on in life. So, the octaves by which we've heard these, the octaves by which men speak, the leadership stature they carry in their body, even as they enter the room, those are what we see as leaders. And so if you are a woman, you're smaller, you speak in lighter sound, lighter voices, and God forbid your skin is the different color or something, you are entering at such a disadvantage that those are obstacles that are almost impossible unless we become conscious of them. Womanhood, women's bodies, policies that require the accommodation for women's bodies, maternity leave, care leave for elderly parents. There are many requirements that would make it more comfortable for women to feel at home in organizations. Lactation rooms, spaces where they feel safe. In international offices, we don't necessarily have adequate restrooms for women. So when they're menstruating, they have a place to go to and have proper hygiene. There are just elements that stand in the way of women really truly feeling like their bodies belong in the workplace. Missing constructs of women in the workplace. And this speaks to really the broader, global, and as US-centric also very much way we look at women. We still look at women, even though they're 51% of the workplace, we look at women's employment as an exception. And everything in our culture is built around women's time and the volunteer care work that they do in the communities, in schools, in churches, in the offices, in their homes. If we looked at the numbers of how much women's care work contributes to the GDP, which is not included, it would be 11% of the GDP, representing the highest sector, but it is not calculated. So it is not part of the economy, but so the entire economy is built on these expectations that women's time is available, and therefore there's no motivation really to build constructs for women to have the time they need to pour into leadership, for example. Concept of the kept woman, and this is really a conservative Christian element where there are still men who feel insecure about the success of a woman whether it's their wife, whether it's their sister. In post-World War II, the US economy established this thing called the living wage, where the man was the main breadwinner and the woman was the caregiver. And it became a sense of pride for many men that their wife was able to stay at home and they would care. And so even I've encountered in my conservative Christian church, men who would tease my husband because I was a leader and I was making an income, and they would call him Mr. Sallinen, which is my maiden name, because they said, oh, you're under her heel because you're letting her work. But actually, thank God my husband is confident enough to overcome, but that's still a prevalent thought. And then finally, there's minority women who face very unique women's issues. First of all, we don't have enough women of color entering the sector because there are these requirements around education, internships, international travel, that sometimes, as we saw in Michelle's presentation yesterday, the economic disadvantage that people of color can come from prevent them from having those. They can't do an unpaid internship. They need an income. So those kinds of requirements prevent women of color entering the sector. And it's interesting because best practices in development right now say that best development decisions are made with the populations who are impacted by the programming around the table, right? So if you are excluding women of color from entering the table where those decisions are being made, you are not going to have strong programming because you're not hearing from the actual populations that are being impacted. So this is a big hurdle that our sector must quickly overcome. So my story here, I just wanted to quickly say it because Beth told hers. So this is me as a young mom. And as a young mom, as a young 20s white woman, patriarchy can work for you. It can be quite okay. I was still early in my career. I was, didn't have my babies yet. We were fine. We were fine in a conservative church that was complementarian, that did not affirm women in any kinds of leadership roles, where I did not have any role models or any mentors to show me how you can do life as a mom and as a leader. And then when I had these babies, I was like, oh boy, this is not going to work out. We're going to need something else. And that's when I felt a calling really to lean into my own voice and my own leadership. And that meant that I had to walk away from that community and find a community that affirms women's leadership. And then, 12 years later, we made it. We're still at it, but painful years of raising kids and leaning into my leadership. And this last picture is, I don't want to brag, but I'm going to brag. The reason that I am such a good leader to this multiracial, multicultural team, this is my team, is because I bring all of myself to my job. I do not code switch. I do not silence myself. I do not say, oh, they don't want to hear from my feminine leadership style. They don't want to hear from my immigrant story. No, I bring it all in because that's how these guys know that they can also bring all of their voices in. And that is a belonging culture. Belonging culture is a culture where each individual can come in with their voice and know that they will be respected. So in our book, we speak a lot and have done a lot of research around belonging. And one of the folks we heard from through an interview is this awesome lady. Many of you know her, Sandra Van Opstal. She's an advocate, she's an author, and she's a consultant in the space. And she spoke to us about the journey from hospitality to solidarity to mutuality. Hospitality is what's happening right now in organizations. We've all seen George Floyd. We've all seen the Women's March. We've seen the things. People get stirred. They're like, okay, we got to do something. Maybe their donors are saying, like, what are you doing for diversity? Or maybe people are really touched by what they're seeing and they feel like, okay, we have to do something as an organization. So they say, okay, let's invite folks in. Let's have a campaign of hiring more folks, women of color, men of color, women. Let's make sure that we have women around the table. That's a hospitality. The leader still holds the mic. The leader still holds power. And he can at any point say, yeah, this is getting kind of messy. I don't really like this. I don't really like the discomfort these conversations are bringing into our organization. So I think I'm going to pull it back. And this is what happens to most organizations and why a lot of efforts fail, because it gets so uncomfortable. You're hearing from someone who you're not used to hearing from. Mature organizations move to solidarity. When they start to hear the stories of the other and they say, okay, this is something that is moving my heart. Something is happening in me. I am feeling empathy towards this person. I feel like I want to hear from this person. I want this person included in conversations. And we start to really hear each other out, no matter how uncomfortable it is. But until we move to mutuality, it's not going to stick. Mutuality is when organizations realize that they cannot do the work at hand without these folks at the table. They begin to insist on having people of diverse backgrounds and racial backgrounds around the table, because they know that the decision-making is going to be stunted without these folks at the table. And so at mutuality, we get to a place where we really start to experience that belonging, where different people's voices start to change how organizations function. And sometimes, Sandra concludes with, sometimes that the guy who's gotten you to a place of hospitality and solidarity may not be the same guy who's going to lead you to mutuality. You may need new leadership. And this is, we talk a lot about this in the book, what is it going to cost you as a leader to include these voices? It may cost you your seat. It may cost you your place. And that's something that leaders who get on this serious journey want to consider. Are they willing to pay the price? So in our book, A Culture of Belonging is a culture where employees feel welcomed, valued, and safe as their genuine selves. This culture is established by leaders who prioritize the individuality, well-being, and success of each employee, and in turn, employees who share in the responsibility of the well-being and success of the organization. So the who you are is welcomed here. You do not have to change yourself to fit into this organization. Verna Myers, who is a diversity consultant, and she said this thing, diversity is being asked to a party. Inclusion is being asked to dance at that party. And we said this, and I don't think it's original to us, maybe others have used it too, but belonging is having a say in what music is being played at the party and what dance steps are we taking here at the party. So it's really that who you are changes what's happening at the party. And so that is belonging. That's what we're after. And so here's a tool for belonging culture. Beth.
Okay, thank you for that. So you've been hearing all these different causes for why we are where we are with the statistics. This is a systemic problem. It doesn't have just one root that can be addressed. And systemic problems require a systems thinking mindset to address them. And so this is our systems thinking mechanism that we have created as part of this book. We look at each one of these levers as areas that organizations need to press on in order to start to move the needle. We are not going to cover all of them today. We're just going to cover two, but I'm just going to give you briefly what each one is, and then you go buy the book and you get to read about all the rest. But there's a chapter dedicated to each lever in our book. So the first one is the Imago Dei. This is a theological position that we do believe that women and men are created in God's image, called for his purposes, and equipped for that calling. And so it's recognizing what that is. And Eeva's going to talk a little bit more about the Imago Dei, because in our Christian world, and what sets us so apart from secular organizations that are trying to do this, is men bringing a marred identity of women into the organization based on their theological upbringing. The second one is, sorry, I'm having trouble reading, strategic case. So again, when I was sharing with you earlier, the executive teams of our organizations very much care what's happening in the corporate world and reaching out to those resources. So if we want to move the needle, we need to be calling out again and again that this isn't just a nice to have for organizations, but in fact, it is a strategic necessity for the future. 2025, we're about to see the millennial and Gen X generation be 75% of the workforce. And if you want to be attracting the best talent in the future, those people want to see diverse workplaces. They prefer to work for women supervisors, and on and on. In addition to seeing increased innovation and addressing some of the many complex issues that are facing global development today. So we need to be regularly reiterating the business case. The third one is organizational culture. And so again, Eeva touched on it, this hyper-masculine, this workaholism culture. Socializing of leadership happens through basketball courts and bike paths and all these spaces where women aren't welcomed, but all those men that join those socializing groups in organizations are suddenly the ones getting promotions. And this happens, and we talk about that in the book. But there's a number of things that impact that culture that have gotten us here. The next one is one that we probably get a lot of talk about, which is HR policies and practices. We need to be looking at everything from recruiting to retirement and every policy and process in between that disadvantages one group over another. Eeva mentioned we see all these women walking in the door, and 18 months later they're walking back out again because they do not find this a place where they can belong. So when we're looking at promotions and raises and all the other aspects of our HR policy. The next one is intentional development. You might not be shocked to know, but as in the sector, the global sector, the percentage of intentional leadership development dollars that go towards men over women is about 70% of our leadership development dollars go to men employees, and only about 30% of our leadership development dollars go to women employees. So again, when we bring that mindset that leaders are men and that's where we invest, we have underinvested in the women in our organization, and particularly young women who we need to be paying close attention to and investing in them to get them on the first leadership rung in the organization so that they are part of the pipeline that rises up to become tomorrow's CEO of World Vision International. Mm-hmm. And I'm not picking on World Vision because they're actually fantastic in a lot of these spaces and leading the way, and their revenue and their performance outcome shows it. So, and then the last one that we are going to focus on a little bit here is leadership will. And that is exactly as it sounds. You can have all these other nice things going on. If your senior leadership decides to remain silent, decides to not prioritize this, a lot of these things aren't going to go anywhere. So that's our system approach. And now Eeva's going to share with you a bit more about the Imago Day.
Great. Yeah, and just keeping an eye on the time. We got to keep going here. So theology, and when we looked at all the different tools that are out there around, this approach is called gender mainstreaming in the secular world. It's the approach by which we are doing everything, right? Everything in our power to bring these levers up in different areas. And so the one missing piece in the secular tools is theology, and it's one of the biggest things that we need as Christians, because our theology can really hold us back from making a change. If you've got things going on in your organization, and you're trying to create a diverse workplace, and you're trying to bring a consultant in here, or you're trying to have an affinity group here, but you've got senior leaders who hold on to a complementarian worldview, and they are not corrected in the organization around that, all of the efforts will be sabotaged. So theological statements is a very important place to start. And here is a quote from one of our interviewees. This is Megan. She said, my boss told me that the pastors were uncomfortable talking to me and asked for a man to come instead. My leader said that they understood the pastor's perspective. They just didn't want to talk to me, a woman, about money. It's like they were all about empowering me, but not at the expense of the bottom line. And so this is something that women run into all the time, which is if there's not a shared way we're looking at gender equality inside of our organizations, each leader can decide for themselves what they feel comfortable with. And if they have their friend, the pastor, say, I really don't want to speak to this lady. She seems nice and all, but we don't really want to be talking to her about the men's stuff, the dollars. And the guy and the leader doesn't know that, nope, that's not what we do here. Then a woman's going to lose out every single time. So I think this is a very poignant example. These things show up in a day to day in microaggressions and things that we can't even, always point to, where women just feel like they are not being included because their leadership is not being considered. So theology first, I already pointed to it earlier. And in the book, we speak about give organizations language that they can include in their own theological statements. We speak about examples of like the air we breathe, the patriarchy and the air we breathe, and the flippant comments that are being made all the time, Kamala Harris and her Jezebel spirit, or Beth Moore, go home, or, then it's not, seminary teaching if a woman is doing. We've heard these statements. They are in the air that we breathe. And if as an organization, we don't say, no, that's not going to fly here. And I don't care what church you go to and what complementarianism you practice in your home, inside these walls, you are going to see women as co-leaders. And that's a starting point. So I'll hand over to you, Beth.
Yep. So we're just going to touch on a couple of cases of leadership will, if you click over to the first slide. So what does it take? We couldn't write a book about creating belonging cultures without wanting to investigate further the people that we know and have heard repeatedly from women around the world are fabulous, co-leading type leaders in all different spaces. And so we've highlighted, and there's much more of their backstory in the book. But here's one. This gentleman's name's Craig Stewart. He was the CEO of the Warehouse Trust in South Africa for many years. And the dynamics in South Africa are complicated. They have been on their own racial justice journey for years. Craig grew up in a very normal household, parents with very traditional roles. Mom stayed at home, dad was off working. But he found himself in a church in the early years that was preaching against women. And there was something in his spirit that did not sit well. And somewhere along the way, and we go into more detail in the book, he made a decision that as a white man in South Africa, it was going to be his responsibility to make sure that he gave opportunity to lift up and give the microphone to, and not be able to take it back, his colleagues and friends that were Black and that were colored that he worked with at the warehouse, and the women who worked at the warehouse. And we have a beautiful little story from some of the women because they were just so taken by the fact that here's a white man in our country who makes sure that we speak first. So one of his things is, his little tip, when he goes into a room and he recognizes, that he is the dominant culture or the traditional, view of leadership, he makes it a point when they try to give him the microphone first or speak first. He said, I'm just here to listen. if that's okay with you. And he takes a seat somewhere in the back, and that's just one of many little things that he and I have talked about over the years of how we do this. This is not easy stuff, and he's not saying he's perfect, and we're not saying he's perfect, but there's all kinds of things that we list in the book about what male allies can be doing and how difficult it is. Next one is Prabhu. Prabhu's from Sri Lanka. He's a senior level leader at Tear Fund. Has an interesting backstory that we go into in the book, but he realized in his younger years he was in a household of abuse. And he found himself in his teen years becoming just like the abuser in his household and mistreating his girlfriends and verbally abusing them, not physical, verbally abusive to his girlfriends. And that started also to play a little bit into other women in his life. And again, he had a wake-up call thanks to a pastor who was willing to call it out. And he had a wake-up call, and he realized, he's becoming the perpetrator that he had hated his entire childhood. And so, again, a point in time where he makes an intentional choice to lead differently. He went on to Tear Fund to create a curriculum called Transforming Masculinity, and has had profound impact around the world in communities to help communities of men and boys and pastors to teach and recognize how they have been conditioned on their gender norms. It's not instilled by God, and it's not, so they've got some great research that they've been doing. If you want to look up Transforming Masculinity. And then let's flip to the next one. So this is what's going to happen. Your organization may say, yes, Beth and Eeva, we want to create a belonging culture, and we want to stand up on a platform and say, we're going to be about welcoming more women leaders. And here's the next day's newsline. Glassdoor comment after one NGO that I was working with, the CEO made exactly that declaration. The next day on Glassdoor, this comment: white males need not apply. If you are a white male, don't bother coming here. You're not wanted. And if you're a white male that already works here, don't expect a promotion anytime soon. Apparently, it's our fault that the organization has maintained masculine norm and leadership positions in the past. So the rest of us have to pay the price to show how diverse we are. It's outright discrimination to appease the women who have been crying foul. Sorry, I can't read that without chuckling. I really shouldn't chuckle. But now match that with our dear sister, Christina Cleveland, Dr. Christina Cleveland, who is a writer, speaker, teacher, author in this space, who actually has been studying this idea of reverse discrimination and what happens in the brain when, let me share this quote. When privileged people are required to participate in a system of equality where everyone gets the same resources and those privileged people don't get any extra boost, it feels like discrimination to them. Think about that. When privileged people are required to participate in a system of equality and they don't get the extra boost, they feel like they are being discriminated against. So she's studying this from a psychological impact, okay? And so that is what drives those silly comments that you see on Glassdoor and other social media spaces when organizations try to do the right thing. Sadly, what happens is leaders get nervous. They're worried they're going to offend their conservative donor base. They're worried they're going to offend the men in their organizations. And so they start to pull back on their language. They start to pull back on their steps. So just a little bit about the importance of leadership will in this. Go ahead, Eeva.
Thanks. And I want to add to this, around the idea of shared leadership. In the organizations where we've seen a belonging thinking start to take root, it doesn't just liberate women, it liberates men. Because men have also been trapped in a culture of toxic masculinity, that same culture that I read that quote from before, where only one type of showing up is allowed. And men are not just that. Men are fathers, men are brothers, men are friends, men are, little league coaches, and all these awesome things that are not just that one thing that is expected of men. And so when women are allowed to show up as themselves, men also are allowed to show up as themselves, and we're all liberated, right? And that's the invitation here. That when we hear, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm envisioning our words hitting, we're going to be at the Accord conference in a couple of months, and that's going to be a different kind of a group of people where this is new information, and it's mostly a lot of white men in that audience, and just how is it going to feel to them to feel that, okay, like I'm being invited to be in a different space, and we want to emphasize this place of shared leadership. So as a little, maybe some of it, maybe you are in this space, maybe you aren't. But if you're a woman who is in the workplace, we wanted to leave you with a few nuggets of things you can do today. If you're finding stress and you're finding this burnout in your own workplace, there are a few things that we feel like all women can do, all men can do. Come on. So here is my colleague, Jenny Yang from World Relief. And Jenny said in the book interview, I realized that ambition is also about saying no to opportunities. Our no can help redefine our mission in life. For young women, I encourage them to be ambitious in ways that affirm who they are and does not detract. For women of color, I say no to giving free advice and strategy that doesn't pay for the years of experience you've accumulated. And I think this is a great statement from Jenny because I don't know if you know her career, but she's a first generation Korean American, very ambitious lady. She goes to Capitol Hill on a routine basis to speak truth to power about immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. She's a powerful, ambitious lady. And for her to have changed her career trajectory after the birth of her first two sons, and yesterday, the birth of Caleb, just yesterday, so the third baby is here, that for her to make this decision for herself, that I can say no to things. I can redefine ambition for myself in ways that builds up my whole life, not just my career. And this is something women maybe haven't had the permission to do in the past, but I'm so excited to see women who are leading the way in this way. We can show up at our workplaces as who we truly are. So, lead from who you are. So many times the trainings directed at women in the workplace are, how to become a better communicating, how to become more assertive, how to become better at time management, and do all these things, right? Lead from who you are. God has gifted you. God has called you. You are it. You are capable and you are able, right? So find out what those things are. Like for me, in my career, it's been really helpful to just figure out who I am and not think that there's something wrong with me, which I did believe all through my 20s and most of my 30s. And to come to a place where like, you know what? God has made me in this way, and what is it that he has for me to do? So that is the call for all of us women. Relentlessly look for organizations that share your values. Sometimes we get caught in toxic workplaces, and sometimes we need the check, frankly. Sometimes we need the health insurance, been there, done that, where you just can't walk away, you need it. But if you have an option, make it known that you're looking for opportunities. Make it known that you're looking for a place where you can belong. And having the right leadership, having the right team can really make the difference between a place that's, burnout, toxic, where you're just making it through the days to where you really can flourish. And finally, build a bigger table. So women sometimes get a bad rep because you make it to the leadership team and you are protecting that slice of the pie. You are there and you're not gonna make a misstep. You're not gonna make an advocacy. You're just there to be a good guy in the leadership team. And the invitation to women is, we have to rally together. We have to be the shoulders that other women can walk on. That is our call. And so the pie is not finite. That's a lie. There is plenty of pie for everyone, including the women who need to come after us, and including the women we need to bring along those tables right now. So we need to build a bigger table. And Beth's going to talk a few minutes about that here.
Yeah, we're just going to wrap up with this piece. I don't think we need to go on to any of the other slides. So for the past 14 months, Eeva and myself and 10 other women from 7 different countries of the world have been working on the creation of a global development sector network for Christian women and male allies. So the Christian Alliance for Inclusive Development launched last week out in the social media sphere. And you can see there what we're trying to accomplish. It's a lot of those pieces of the system that we said we needed to move the needle on. So we're a network of women and male allies working together to make a better space in the global development space for women and the women that we serve. This is a place where we come together in community, network, and relationship building. We bring our voices together for research and using that research for the purpose of advocacy, because we don't have the McKinsey type research for our sector, where we find restoration and spiritual nourishment, and again, where we do have opportunities for equipping and leadership development. And so that's what the Christian Alliance is all about. You can get involved by going to the welcomingtable.org, and you'll find ways to be part of our August 11th table talk, where we're going to have conversation about this new table that we're building together. We welcome you. This is not a done product. This is a product in formation. And so really pleased with where it's going so far, but we welcome all of your voices to help us build a welcoming table that includes women and men together, leading to have a greater impact on poverty in all of its forms.
And this is not in competition of where we are today. Mimi is one of the advisory committee members, and she is, CBE is a theological arm of this alliance. So we're not competing with what's the awesome work that's happening here in this event, but we're just expanding it to include this development sector piece. So real quick, our book is coming out. We hope you get it. We hope to continue the conversation with you all. And we're available on LinkedIn and Instagram for comments or questions. I know we have to wrap it up. I'm really sorry we went so long today, but appreciate your attention and thank you for coming.